The spring of 1945. The Philippine Sea. If you open any standard history textbook and read about the final year of the Pacific War, you will find a very specific, carefully curated narrative. You will read about majestic, towering American aircraft carriers cutting through the azure waves, launching swarms of fighter planes into the sky. You will read about the legendary grit of the Marines raising the flag on jagged islands, supported by the deafening, unstoppable barrage of massive battleship cannons. The official narrative is one of overwhelming, highly organized, and flawlessly executed American military supremacy. But out here, in a desolate, forgotten stretch of the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest glorious fleet engagement, the war was not a triumphant newsreel. It was a terrifying, claustrophobic nightmare of blinding fog, rusted iron, and absolute isolation. And it was about to become the site of one of the most terrifying, physics-defying naval encounters of the entire 20th century. An encounter that the United States Department of the Navy would immediately classify, aggressively redact, and deliberately bury for over half a century. Drifting aimlessly in the cold, gray swells was a battered American supply barge. It was not a warship. It had no heavy armor plating, no sleek hydrodynamic hull, and absolutely zero offensive capabilities. It was essentially a massive, flat-bottomed, floating warehouse constructed of cheap steel, designed solely to haul hundreds of tons of dry rations and raw materials to the active front lines. But right now, the barge was completely dead in the water. Hours earlier, a catastrophic failure in the main boiler room had completely destroyed the propulsion system, leaving the massive, heavy vessel drifting completely blind in the center of a dense, suffocating marine fog bank. The fog was not just weather. It was a physical, oppressive entity. It rolled across the rusted deck plates in thick, damp waves, cutting visibility down to less than 10 feet. The ocean itself was dead calm, perfectly flat, and entirely silent. There was no wind. The only sound was the agonizing, rhythmic, metallic groan of the barge's heavy steel hull shifting in the slow ocean swells, and the steady, terrified breathing of the men trapped aboard. Standing on the rusted, salt-stained deck were 20 men. They were not hardened Navy SEALs. They were not artillery gunners, and they were not trained torpedo men. They were 20 African-American Navy cooks and mess attendants. In the rigidly segregated, fiercely prejudiced United States Navy of the 1940s, black sailors were explicitly and systematically banned from serving in active combat roles. The establishment did not view them as warriors. The system forced them into the steward's branch, handing them white canvas aprons, ladles, and scrub brushes instead of rifles and rangefinders. They were the invisible workforce of the fleet. They spent their war deep in the sweltering, unventilated bowels of the ships, boiling potatoes, scraping charred baking pans, and serving coffee to the men who were actually allowed to fight. They were entirely unarmed. The closest thing they had to a weapon on the entire drifting barge was a set of heavy, cast-iron meat cleavers and a few rusted fire axes hanging in glass cases on the bulkheads. They were entirely alone, swallowed by the fog, left behind by a military machine that viewed a broken logistics barge as a complete write-off. But they were not truly alone in the water. Beneath the calm gray surface of the Philippine Sea, gliding silently through the crushing, freezing darkness of the deep ocean, was an apex predator. It was an elite Imperial Japanese Navy attack submarine. A sleek, highly advanced, 3,000-ton marvel of hydroengineering. It was heavily armored, entirely invisible, and armed to the teeth with massive, oxygen-fueled underwater missiles capable of snapping a destroyer completely in half with a single strike. The Japanese commander, peering through the periscope, did not know he was stalking a broken boat full of unarmed cooks. He simply saw a massive acoustic shadow on his sonar. He saw an American vessel, dead in the water, completely separated from its heavily armed destroyer escorts. To the submarine commander, it was an incredibly rare, effortless opportunity for a total slaughter. Up on the fog-choked deck of the drifting barge, the 20 mess attendants stood frozen in terror. The thick marine fog was so dense that water droplets were condensing on their faces and rolling down their stained white aprons like cold sweat. And then, cutting straight through the dead silence of the ocean, came a sound that would stop the heart of any sailor in the Pacific. Ping! It was a high-pitched, metallic, perfectly rhythmic acoustic chirp. It vibrated physically through the steel hull of the barge, traveling up through the floorboards and right through the boots of the terrified cooks. Ping! It was the terrifying sound of active sonar. The underwater predator had found them. It was pinging their hull to calculate the exact firing solution for its torpedoes. The submarine was circling them in the black depths, entirely invisible, mathematically preparing to blow the bottom of their ship completely out of the water. The cooks looked at one another in the freezing fog. They had no depth charges to drop. They had no deck guns to fire back. They had absolutely no way to call for help, and they had exactly nowhere to run. The ocean was thousands of feet deep, and the nearest land was 100 miles away. According to every single law of naval warfare, they were already dead men. But the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese submarine commander had both made the exact same fatal miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the raw, desperate ingenuity of the working class. Because deep inside the cargo hold of that sinking barge, the head cook, a massive, grease-stained industrial baker from the south side of Chicago, was not looking for a life raft. He was looking at 300 massive canvas sacks of finely milled, highly volatile baking flour, and he was doing the terrifying, explosive math of thermobaric physics. Far removed from the suffocating, blinding fog bank where the broken barge drifted, the reality of the United States Navy looked entirely different. Just 30 nautical miles to the east, cutting through clear, sunlit waters at a brisk 20 knots, was the heavy destroyer escort that was supposed to be protecting them. On the pristine, climate-controlled bridge of the destroyer, there was no panic. There was only the quiet, efficient hum of advanced radar equipment, the rich smell of freshly brewed, high-grade officer's coffee, and the crisp rustle of starched, immaculately pressed khaki uniforms. Standing at the center of the bridge, looking through a pair of polished brass binoculars, was the fleet admiral in charge of the convoy. He was a man born into immense wealth, a legacy officer who had spent his entire life in elite academies. To him, naval warfare was a grand, sophisticated chessboard. And on that board, sailors were not living, breathing men. They were simply numbers on a logistics report, acceptable and necessary losses in the pursuit of a spotless, medal-winning career. A young, heavily sweating radar technician stared intensely at his glowing green screen. He saw two distinct, undeniable blips. One was stationary, trapped deep within the fog bank, the crippled supply barge holding the 20 African-American cooks. The other blip was moving incredibly fast, submerged, closing the distance to the barge with terrifying speed. The technician's voice trembled as he formally reported the presence of an Imperial Japanese attack submarine. He frantically calculated the coordinates, turned to the admiral, and waited for the inevitable order to sound the general alarm. He expected the admiral to spin the massive destroyer around, charge back into the blinding fog, and drop a devastating barrage of heavy depth charges to save their stranded brothers. The admiral did not order the ship to turn around. He did not even reach for the radio to broadcast a desperate warning to the 20 men trapped on the broken vessel. He calmly took a slow sip of his warm coffee, looked down at the glowing radar screen, and made a cold, heartless, and mathematically ruthless calculation. The Japanese submarine was an elite, apex hunter. If the heavy destroyer went back into that dense fog, it risked taking a massive torpedo directly to its own hull. But if they just kept sailing away, the submarine would inevitably waste its highly valuable torpedoes on a stationary, entirely worthless supply barge. The admiral looked at his terrified junior officer and explicitly stated that turning a multi-million-dollar warship around for a segregated crew of cooks and a load of baking supplies was a complete waste of Navy fuel. He was intentionally leaving them as live bait. He was deliberately feeding 20 American citizens to a metallic shark in the dark, just to guarantee his own ship's safe, glorious passage back to Pearl Harbor. Have you ever worked a job where you poured your blood, sweat, and tears into the work, only for a corrupt, arrogant manager to throw you entirely under the bus just to protect their own bonus or reputation? If you know that exact kind of burning, helpless rage, sound off in the comments below right now. Let us know exactly what they did to you, because what happens next on that drifting barge is the ultimate, historically suppressed revenge for every worker who has ever been treated like disposable trash. Back in the freezing, suffocating fog, the 20 cooks did not need a radio transmission from an arrogant admiral to know they had been deliberately abandoned. The crushing, heavy silence of the ocean told them everything. The distant, comforting rumble of their escort's massive engines had faded away completely hours ago. The United States Navy had left them in the dark to die. And in that darkness, the acoustic terror was escalating rapidly. The sharp, metallic ping of the Japanese active sonar was no longer a distant, faint echo. It was getting louder, faster, and infinitely more aggressive. The submarine was tightening its circle like a noose. The agonizing intervals between the pings shrank from 10 seconds, down to 5 seconds, down to 3. Every single chirp of the sonar violently rattled the rusted steel floorboards beneath the cook's wet boots. It was the terrifying sound of a firing solution being finalized. The Japanese commander was mathematically mapping the exact length, draft, and structural weaknesses of the barge, preparing to flood his forward torpedo tubes. Panic, raw and unadulterated, began to tear through the segregated mess crew. These were men who had been handed spatulas and scrub brushes, not combat survival training. A few of the younger cooks, teenagers drafted straight out of the segregated neighborhoods of Detroit and Atlanta, violently shattered the glass emergency cases on the bulkheads. They grabbed heavy, rusted fire axes, their eyes wide with sheer terror, staring blindly into the impenetrable white fog, as if they could somehow chop a massive, high-explosive torpedo out of the air. Others fell heavily to their knees on the wet, freezing deck plates, burying their faces in their stained white aprons, praying frantically to a god that seemed millions of miles away from this cursed ocean. But standing near the heavy iron doors of the main cargo hold, completely, perfectly still, was Petty Officer Dutch Miller. He was the head cook of the mess deck. Dutch was a massive, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, his massive hands scarred from years of hard labor, his white canvas apron permanently stained with black grease and dried dough. He did not come from a wealthy military family. He had not spent a single day in a naval academy. Before the war, Dutch was a master industrial baker in the massive, sweltering, high-pressure flour mills of Chicago. He was a blue-collar worker who had spent his entire life surrounded by massive, grinding machinery and raw, volatile organic materials. He understood the hidden, terrifying physics of the world far better than any Ivy League engineer. Dutch listened to the rapid, accelerating ping of the sonar echoing through the fog. He knew the brutal reality of naval warfare. He knew that in less than 10 minutes, a massive, oxygen-fueled torpedo was going to physically tear their rusted barge entirely in half, dragging every single one of them down to the crushing, freezing depths of the Pacific. He looked at the panicked, crying men holding the rusted fire axes. He looked at the impenetrable, dense marine fog clinging heavily to the wet steel deck. And then he looked straight down into the pitch-black, cavernous belly of the main cargo hold. Stacked to the ceiling, in massive, teetering rows, were 300 heavy canvas sacks of finely milled, industrial-grade baking flour. While the arrogant admiral, miles away, saw a worthless, expendable load of food rations, and the terrified cooks saw nothing but a heavy, watery grave, the Chicago baker saw a weapon of absolute, catastrophic destruction. He knew a deadly scientific truth that the United States Navy had completely overlooked. Under the exact right atmospheric conditions, when mixed with heavy fog and confined space, suspended microscopic flour dust is vastly more volatile, more explosive, and exponentially more devastating than commercial dynamite. Dutch was not going to pray, and he was not going to wait for the torpedo. He was going to turn the entire ocean into a catastrophic, thermobaric vacuum bomb. Dutch Miller did not shout. He did not have to. In the freezing, suffocating fog, his deep, gravelly voice cut through the sheer panic of the mess deck like a heavy iron cleaver. He grabbed the nearest terrified teenager, a 19-year-old kid from Detroit who was blindly clutching a rusted fire axe, and physically shoved him toward the heavy steel doors of the main cargo hold. "Drop the axe and grab a sack," Dutch roared, his massive frame blocking the icy sea wind. "Every single man on this deck, into the hold. Bring the flour up. All of it. Move!" The 20 African-American Navy cooks did not understand the complex physics of what Dutch was planning, but they understood the absolute, undeniable authority in the Chicago baker's voice. Driven by pure, unadulterated terror and the relentless, accelerating metallic ping of the Japanese sonar echoing through the hull, the men descended into the pitch-black, freezing belly of the broken supply barge. They formed a frantic, desperate bucket brigade up the steep, rusted metal stairwells. They were not hauling high-explosive ammunition or artillery shells. They were hauling massive, 100-pound canvas sacks of extra-fine, industrial-grade winter wheat baking flour. Their muscles screamed in absolute agony. Their white canvas navy aprons were completely soaked through with terrified sweat and freezing ocean condensation. The heavy canvas sacks scraped against the jagged iron bulkheads, occasionally tearing open and spilling perfectly pristine white powder over the rusted, oil-stained steel floorboards. Within 20 agonizing minutes, the exhausted, shivering cooks had hauled over 300 massive sacks to the top deck. Under Dutch's furious direction, they dragged them to the exact center of the barge, violently slashing the thick canvas open with their heavy cast-iron meat cleavers. They dumped the flour into massive, towering white mounds. In the absolute center of the bleak, gray, fog-choked ocean, surrounded by rusted iron, the pristine white piles of baking flour looked completely absurd. It looked like the desperate, meaningless gesture of men who had simply lost their minds to the terror of the deep. But Dutch was not losing his mind. He was meticulously, coldly engineering a weapon of mass destruction. While the men frantically hauled the flour, Dutch and two older mechanics sprinted to the aft section of the barge, violently kicking open the louvered doors of the auxiliary ventilation shafts. Using heavy steel crowbars and sheer, desperate adrenaline, they ripped 3 massive, cast-iron centrifugal blower fans directly out of their mounts. These were industrial-grade turbines, designed to force heavy, pressurized air deep down into the cargo holds to prevent the buildup of toxic mold. They dragged the massive, heavy-duty fans across the wet, slippery deck, hauling the thick, insulated electrical cables behind them. They wired the fans directly into the barge's sputtering emergency diesel generator. Dutch positioned the 3 massive blowers in a tight, calculated semicircle, aiming their wide, grated nozzles directly at the towering mounds of pristine white flour. To the aristocratic officers of the United States Navy, flour was nothing more than carbohydrates and calories. A cheap, inert supply meant to bake fresh bread for the wardroom. But any industrial baker who has worked in the massive, sweltering, high-pressure commercial mills of Chicago or New York knows a terrifying, heavily suppressed scientific truth. When flour is compacted tightly inside a canvas sack, it is completely harmless. You can hold a blowtorch directly to it, and it will merely smolder and turn black. But when that exact same finely milled organic powder is violently blown into the air, separating the microscopic particles and surrounding every single individual grain with pure oxygen, it ceases to be food. It instantly transforms into a highly volatile, fuel-air explosive mixture. It becomes a raw, thermobaric weapon. If ignited by a single, high-heat spark, the suspended dust cloud will burn at an exponential, catastrophic rate. The violent chemical reaction instantly vaporizes all the oxygen in the surrounding atmosphere, creating a massive, localized vacuum, followed immediately by a concussive, supersonic shockwave, capable of leveling a reinforced concrete building. Dutch was not trying to fight the submarine with bullets. He was turning the entire dense, foggy atmosphere above the barge into a microscopic, inescapable minefield. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The rhythmic metallic ping of the Japanese active sonar abruptly stopped. The freezing ocean plunged back into an absolute, deafening, heavy silence. The terrified cooks froze in place, dropping their empty canvas sacks, staring blindly out into the impenetrable white fog. The sudden absence of sound was infinitely worse than the pinging. It meant the submarine was no longer searching. It meant the underwater predator had finalized its firing solution. The young men braced themselves against the rusted bulkheads, squeezing their eyes tightly shut, waiting for the massive, deafening impact of an oxygen-fueled torpedo to physically tear the steel deck out from under their boots. But Dutch stood perfectly still, his massive hand tightly gripping the rusted handle of a standard-issue Navy flare gun. He knew the brutal, calculated economics of naval warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy was ruthless, but by 1945, they were also desperately low on resources. A Type 95 Long Lance torpedo was a multi-million-dollar, highly advanced piece of military technology, reserved strictly for sinking heavy cruisers and aircraft carriers. The elite Japanese submarine commander, peering through his periscope at a broken, entirely unarmed, flat-bottomed supply barge, would never waste a highly valuable torpedo on such a worthless target. He would not shoot them from the dark. He would surface. He would bring his massive 3,000-ton submarine directly up alongside the helpless barge, open his heavy steel hatches, and use his 140mm deck cannon and heavy machine guns to casually slaughter the crew and sink the ship for absolutely zero cost. The Japanese commander was going to walk, perfectly, arrogantly, right into the baker's kitchen. Dutch slowly raised his hand, signaling the terrified, exhausted cooks to duck down behind the heavy iron winches and massive coils of anchor chain. They vanished into the freezing shadows, wrapping wet rags tightly around their mouths and noses to protect their lungs. Dutch cocked the heavy hammer of the flare gun. The single magnesium shell loaded inside it was the only spark he needed. Through the dense, suffocating white fog, the calm surface of the black ocean suddenly began to boil. A massive, unnatural displacement of water hissed and frothed just 30 yards off the port side of the barge. The overwhelming, sickening stench of raw diesel exhaust violently cut through the salty sea air. What would you do if you were entirely abandoned in the middle of the ocean, staring at an invincible war machine with nothing but kitchen supplies to defend yourself? Would you surrender? Or would you try to build an impossible weapon? Tell us your exact survival strategy in the comments right now, because the trap these cooks are about to spring is going to violently rewrite the laws of naval combat. The water broke, and the colossal, dripping black sail of the Imperial Japanese attack submarine breached the surface like a prehistoric leviathan rising from the deep. The water of the Philippine Sea did not just break, it erupted. A massive, unnatural surge of freezing gray water cascaded violently down the slick, rubberized steel sides of the Imperial Japanese Navy attack submarine as it breached the surface. It was a colossal, 3,000-ton apex predator, its sleek, hydrodynamic hull designed to slip entirely undetected through the crushing depths of the ocean. Now, sitting perfectly parallel to the rusted, broken American supply barge, it looked like a terrifying metallic leviathan. The sheer displacement of water violently rocked the flat-bottomed barge, sending a shockwave through the rusted deck plates that knocked several of the exhausted, terrified cooks completely off their feet. The overwhelming, sickening stench of raw diesel exhaust and stagnant bilge water instantly cut through the salty, freezing marine fog. The submarine was so close, less than 40 feet from the port side of the barge, that the terrified cooks hiding behind the massive iron winches could hear the heavy, mechanical hum of its massive diesel engines shifting gears. Up on the conning tower of the submarine, heavy steel locking wheels spun with a sharp, metallic screech. The main waterproof hatches were violently kicked open from the inside. The elite Japanese submarine commander climbed out into the freezing, fog-choked Pacific air. He was dressed in a pristine, dark naval uniform, his binoculars hanging heavily around his neck. He was a veteran of a ruthless, unforgiving underwater war, a man accustomed to stalking heavily armored cruisers and dodging relentless depth-charge barrages. He stepped out onto the wet steel grating of the conning tower and looked down at his prey. He did not see a warship. He saw a floating graveyard. The American barge was completely dead in the water, its hull streaked with heavy rust and deep, jagged dents. There were no massive 5-inch deck guns tracking his submarine. There were no heavy machine gun nests. Through the dense, swirling white fog, the commander could just barely make out the terrified, shivering silhouettes of the African-American mess crew cowering behind coils of heavy anchor chain. They were wearing stained white canvas aprons, completely unarmed, clutching nothing but absolute, paralyzing fear. A slow, cold smile crept across the Japanese commander's face. In the brutal, calculated economics of naval warfare, this was the ultimate free prize. He did not need to waste a multi-million-dollar, highly advanced oxygen torpedo on a worthless logistics barge. He could simply use his 140mm deck cannon to casually blast the rusted hull completely to pieces, sending the massive cargo of American supplies straight to the bottom of the ocean, and be submerged again before any Allied destroyer even knew he was there. He barked a sharp, guttural command down the open hatch. Within seconds, a half-dozen elite Japanese sailors poured out onto the wet, slippery deck of the submarine. They moved with terrifying practiced military precision, sprinting straight for the massive, heavy iron deck gun and the twin anti-aircraft machine guns mounted on the aft deck. They violently racked the heavy bolts, loading armor-piercing ammunition, aiming the lethal black muzzles directly at the center of the rusted American barge. The 20 cooks squeezed their eyes shut, burying their faces in their grease-stained hands. They could hear the metallic clatter of the heavy machine guns being armed. They were entirely defenseless. The execution was only seconds away. But crouched deep in the freezing shadows of the auxiliary ventilation housing, Petty Officer Dutch Miller did not close his eyes. The massive, blue-collar, industrial baker from Chicago stared intensely through the thick marine fog, his thumb resting heavily on the rusted steel hammer of a standard-issue Navy flare gun. He watched the Japanese gunners locking their sights. He looked at the massive, open steel hatches on the deck of the submarine, leading directly down into the vulnerable, pressurized belly of the beast. And then he looked at the massive, towering white mounds of highly volatile baking flour piled directly in front of the 3 heavy-duty centrifugal blower fans. The Japanese commander raised his hand to order the firing squad to open up. Dutch violently slammed his massive fist down onto the heavy iron ignition switch of the emergency diesel generator. The barge's rusted generator violently coughed, sputtered, and roared to life with a deafening, choking mechanical scream. Instantly, the 3 massive, industrial-grade centrifugal fans spun up to maximum velocity. These turbines were not designed for gentle air circulation. They were built to force highly pressurized, heavy air deep down into the massive cargo holds of the logistics ship. When that hurricane of mechanical wind hit the towering mounds of extra-fine, industrial-grade winter wheat flour, the physics of the Pacific Ocean violently changed. 300 massive canvas sacks worth of perfectly pristine white powder were violently blasted into the freezing, damp air. It did not just blow away, it aerosolized. The intense, highly pressurized wind violently separated the microscopic organic particles, completely surrounding every single individual grain of flour with pure, highly combustible oxygen. The dense, natural, gray marine fog over the ocean was instantly, violently swallowed by a blinding, impenetrable, artificial whiteout condition. The massive cloud of suspended flour dust surged across the 40-foot gap of open water like a terrifying, localized blizzard, slamming directly into the exposed deck of the Imperial Japanese submarine. The elite Japanese gunners were instantly blinded. The microscopic, extra-fine flour violently choked their open lungs and coated their wet eyes in a thick, burning white paste. They dropped away from the heavy machine guns, coughing violently, blindly grasping at the air as the suffocating white dust completely enveloped the conning tower. The flour was sucked straight down the open, vulnerable steel hatches of the submarine, violently drawn into the heavy air intakes of the massive diesel engines. The Japanese commander, completely blinded and violently choking on the microscopic powder, screamed frantic, confused orders. He thought it was a chemical gas attack. He had absolutely no idea that the American supply boat had just completely saturated the entire local atmosphere with one of the most highly volatile, explosive fuel-air mixtures on the planet. Through the blinding, swirling white chaos of the dust storm, Dutch Miller stepped out from behind the rusted iron winches. He did not look like a terrified cook in a stained apron. He stood with the heavy, unyielding posture of a man who commanded the very laws of industrial thermodynamics. He did not aim the rusted flare gun at the Japanese submarine. He did not aim it at the heavily armed gunners. Dutch pointed the heavy steel barrel directly straight up into the absolute dead center of the massive, suspended, highly oxygenated cloud of white flour dust hanging heavily between the 2 vessels. He pulled the trigger. The heavy firing pin violently struck the primer. A single, blindingly bright, magnesium phosphorus flare shot out of the rusted barrel with a sharp, deafening crack. It streaked upward into the blinding white dust cloud, burning at a terrifying 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the absolute, perfect, catastrophic spark. The Imperial Japanese Navy was about to learn a terrifying, mathematically inescapable lesson in blue-collar chemistry. The magnesium flare did not gracefully arc through the sky. It violently punched directly into the absolute center of the suffocating, artificially pressurized cloud of suspended flour dust. For a microscopic fraction of a second, the freezing, fog-choked expanse of the Philippine Sea was suspended in a state of terrifying, perfect silence. The massive, roaring diesel engines of the Imperial Japanese submarine and the frantic, choking gasps of the elite deck gunners seemed to entirely mute themselves, bowing to the immutable, catastrophic laws of industrial physics that were about to be unleashed. A single particle of extra-fine, industrial-grade winter wheat flour is entirely harmless. But when millions of those microscopic particles are forcefully suspended in the air, each one entirely surrounded by pure oxygen, they cease to be baking supplies. They become an aerosolized, fuel-air explosive matrix. When the 3,000-degree phosphorus spark of the flare made contact with the absolute center of that white cloud, it initiated a catastrophic, exponential chain reaction. One ignited particle instantly flash incinerated the 10 particles surrounding it. Those 10 incinerated 100. Those 100 incinerated 1,000,000. This massive, violent chemical oxidation did not take seconds to occur. It happened in a span of time too fast for the human eye to process. The resulting explosion was not a traditional Hollywood-style rolling orange fireball of burning gasoline. It was a blinding, absolute white-blue flash of pure, localized stellar heat. It was as if a piece of the sun had suddenly, violently detonated directly between the rusted American supply barge and the sleek, hydrodynamic hull of the 3,000-ton attack submarine. The physics of a thermobaric dust explosion dictate a terrifying, two-stage process of absolute destruction, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was completely unprepared for both of them. The first stage was the positive pressure shockwave. As the microscopic flour particles violently incinerated, the surrounding atmospheric gases expanded at a supersonic velocity. A colossal, invisible wall of solid kinetic energy erupted outward from the center of the dust cloud. When this supersonic shockwave slammed into the freezing surface of the Pacific Ocean, it instantly flattened the water, vaporizing the dense, heavy marine fog in a 2-mile radius, and creating a perfect, terrifyingly clear dome of visibility. When that same solid wall of kinetic energy slammed into the exposed upper deck of the Japanese submarine, the results were completely devastating. The elite, heavily armed Japanese gunners, who had been coughing and blindly swatting at the white powder just milliseconds before, were instantly vaporized or violently launched like broken rag dolls into the boiling, frothing ocean. The heavy, 140mm iron deck cannon, bolted to the hull with thick steel rivets, was physically ripped from its mounts and twisted into a jagged, unrecognizable shape of warped metal. But the true, world-ending terror of the Baker's bomb was the second stage: the vacuum. The massive, instantaneous flash incineration of the flour dust violently consumed absolutely every single molecule of oxygen within a 50-yard radius. This sudden, catastrophic absence of atmosphere created a massive, localized negative pressure void, a vacuum. The 3,000-ton Imperial Japanese attack submarine was a marvel of hydroengineering, specifically designed and heavily reinforced to withstand the crushing, uniform hydrostatic pressure of the deep ocean. It was built with thick, curved Krupp steel to keep the immense weight of the water out. It was absolutely, fundamentally, not designed to survive a massive, asymmetric thermobaric vacuum trying to violently rip its steel plates off. The violent negative pressure wave slammed into the submarine. The massive heavy steel locking hatches on the conning tower, which the arrogant Japanese commander had kicked open just moments before, were violently ripped entirely off their hinges. Worse still, the massive Maybach diesel engines of the submarine had been running at full capacity, desperately drawing in the surrounding air to breathe. They had sucked the highly volatile, explosive white flour dust directly down into the intake manifolds, the ventilation shafts, and the cramped, pressurized crew compartments. The explosion did not just hit the outside of the submarine. It violently chased the dust straight down into the belly of the beast. A catastrophic, secondary internal explosion violently ripped through the pressurized hull of the submarine. The airtight steel bulkheads, designed to keep the crew safe from flooding, instantly transformed into lethal, high-velocity shrapnel. The heavy steel hull of the invincible, underwater apex predator physically bulged outward, glowing with a sickly, terrifying, cherry-red heat, before emitting a deafening, agonizing, tectonic screech. The main pressure hull violently cracked, a massive, jagged fissure ripping down the port side of the vessel. The ocean, cold and merciless, instantly rushed into the massive glowing wound. The freezing Pacific water violently collided with the superheated, melting steel of the submarine's internal machinery, creating a secondary, catastrophic explosion of expanding steam that completely gutted whatever remained of the engine room. Less than 40 feet away, the rusted, flat-bottomed American supply barge violently shuddered, rolling heavily to starboard as the massive, displaced waves of the explosion slammed into its side. But unlike the rigid, sealed pressure hull of the submarine, the barge was open, flat, and uniquely positioned. Dutch had purposely aimed the massive industrial blower fans away from his own ship, projecting the aerosolized dust cloud entirely over the open water and directly onto the enemy vessel. The 20 African-American Navy cooks, hurled violently to the wet, rusted deck plates by the sheer concussive force of the shockwave, covered their bleeding ears and gasped desperately for air as the oxygen rapidly rushed back into the localized vacuum. They were severely bruised, temporarily deafened, and completely covered in a thick, sticky layer of wet soot and baked, blackened flour. But as they slowly, painfully pushed themselves up from the freezing iron floorboards, they realized an impossible, undeniable truth. They were breathing. They were alive. Through the violently cleared air, under a suddenly open, pale gray Pacific sky, they looked over the port railing. The terrifying, elite, 3,000-ton Imperial Japanese attack submarine, the apex predator that had been hunting them in the dark, the heavily armed killer that the arrogant American Admiral had sacrificed them to, was gone. In its place was a massive, churning, boiling vortex of toxic black diesel fuel, warped, sinking iron, and the charred remnants of a destroyed conning tower, slowly slipping forever beneath the freezing waves. Petty Officer Dutch Miller, the blue-collar industrial baker from the south side of Chicago, pulled himself up using the rusted housing of the emergency diesel generator. His massive hands were trembling, his white canvas apron completely scorched and blackened by the thermobaric flash. He looked at the boiling, empty ocean, and then he looked back at the 19 terrified, exhausted young men from the segregated mess deck who were staring at him with absolute, unadulterated awe. They had not fired a single heavy artillery shell. They had not launched a single torpedo. They had used 3 industrial ventilation fans, a pile of baking supplies, and the immutable, terrifying laws of working-class physics to completely erase a billion-dollar war machine from the face of the earth. For a brief, shining moment in the middle of a forgotten ocean, the men who had been ordered to quietly scrape pans in the dark had become the deadliest, most destructive force in the entire United States Navy. The silence that descended upon the Philippine Sea in the aftermath of the Baker's bomb was entirely unlike the heavy, terrifying quiet of the fog that had preceded it. It was the absolute, dead silence of total mechanical annihilation. The blinding, localized, thermobaric flash had violently burned away the dense marine fog for miles in every direction, leaving the rusted American supply barge floating under a suddenly clear, pale blue Pacific sky. The 20 African-American Navy cooks slowly picked themselves up from the twisted, freezing iron floorboards. Their white canvas aprons were completely unrecognizable, heavily scorched by the flash, and plastered to their bodies with a thick, sticky paste of wet soot and baked flour. Their ears were ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine from the supersonic shockwave, but they were breathing. They staggered to the portside railing, gripping the cold steel, and stared down at the water. The elite, 3,000-ton Imperial Japanese attack submarine was completely gone. The invincible underwater predator that had terrorized the Pacific Fleet had been violently erased from existence. All that remained was a massive, bubbling slick of toxic black diesel fuel, a few floating pieces of cork insulation, and the warped, melted remnants of the conning tower, dragging the shattered pressure hull down into the crushing, freezing depths of the ocean abyss. Petty Officer Dutch Miller leaned heavily against the rusted housing of the emergency diesel generator. His massive, scarred hands were trembling, completely coated in black grease and gray ash. He looked at the boiling water, and then he looked at the 19 young men from the segregated mess deck. They were not soldiers. They were not supposed to be here. But they had just successfully executed one of the most devastating, physics-defying mechanical ambushes in the history of naval warfare. For 2 hours, they drifted in the clear, freezing air, entirely alone with the ghosts of the destroyed submarine. And then, cutting through the quiet rhythm of the ocean swells, came the deep, unmistakable, thrumming vibration of massive Allied steam turbines. Appearing on the horizon, moving at a brisk, arrogant 20 knots, was the heavy American destroyer escort. The pristine, heavily armored warship had not turned around to save them. The fleet admiral had explicitly abandoned the barge hours ago, fully expecting it to be torpedoed and sunk, leaving the cooks to drown in the dark. The destroyer was only returning now to visually confirm the wreckage, log the loss of the logistics cargo, and clear the grid sector. As the massive, spotless gray warship slowed its engines and pulled up alongside the battered supply barge, the officers standing on the climate-controlled bridge were completely paralyzed by absolute, slack-jawed incomprehension. The fleet admiral stepped out onto the pristine exterior wing of the bridge, his polished leather boots gleaming in the Pacific sun. He lowered his polished brass binoculars, his aristocratic face pale with confusion. He looked at the massive, churning slick of black diesel fuel and destroyed Japanese submarine debris floating in the water. And then he looked across the 50-foot gap of open ocean at the rusted, soot-covered supply barge that was somehow, impossibly, still afloat. He saw the 20 black cooks, covered in ash and grease, standing defiantly among the massive, empty canvas sacks and the violently dismantled industrial blower fans. Dutch stepped forward to the edge of the barge, his massive frame towering over the railing. He offered an exhausted, heavy salute. "Petty Officer Miller, Steward's Branch, sir." Dutch's deep, gravelly voice echoed across the water. "The Imperial Japanese submarine has been entirely neutralized." "We held the cargo, sir." The fleet admiral did not return the salute. He gripped the polished brass railing of his destroyer, his eyes darting frantically from the destroyed submarine slick to the unarmed cooks. In his rigidly segregated, deeply prejudiced worldview, the reality in front of him was mathematically and fundamentally impossible. "You neutralized a 3,000-ton attack submarine, Petty Officer," the admiral asked, his voice dripping with cold, aristocratic disgust and heavy condescension. "Are you aware of what you are saying? You are a mess attendant. You do not have a single deck gun on that barge." "We did not use guns, sir," Dutch replied, his jaw set like carved granite. "They surfaced to execute us with their deck cannons. We used the industrial ventilation fans and 300 sacks of finely milled winter wheat. We aerosolized the flour into a suspended dust cloud and ignited it with a magnesium flare. The thermobaric vacuum cracked their pressure hull." The admiral stared at the massive Chicago baker for 5 agonizing seconds. And then he let out a sharp, cruel, entirely dismissive laugh. "You expect me to believe you baked a Japanese submarine to death," the admiral sneered, shaking his head. He turned to his impeccably dressed executive officer. "This is absurd. The enemy vessel obviously suffered a catastrophic internal malfunction with their own experimental oxygen torpedoes. They blew themselves up." Dutch's hands tightened into massive, heavy fists at his sides. The 19 young cooks behind him froze, the brief, shining pride of their impossible victory instantly curdling into a suffocating, sickening realization. "We built the trap, sir," Dutch growled, the raw anger vibrating in his chest. "We triggered the explosion. My men risked their lives." The admiral's face flushed red with sudden, arrogant fury. The idea that a crew of segregated blue-collar laborers had outsmarted and outfought an elite naval war machine using kitchen supplies was a narrative his establishment pride simply could not accept. He looked down at the massive, empty canvas sacks slashed open on the deck of the barge. "The only thing I see, Petty Officer, is a disorganized, panicked mess crew that completely lost their minds when a submarine surfaced," the admiral snapped, his voice echoing like a whip across the water. "I see 300 sacks of vital United States Navy food rations, violently and maliciously destroyed by a panicked kitchen staff. The admiral turned to the heavily armed military police officers standing on the deck of the destroyer. "Master-at-arms," the admiral ordered, his voice cold, absolute, and entirely heartless. "Board that barge. Confiscate their flare guns and axes. Arrest Petty Officer Miller immediately. I am charging him with the willful destruction of government property and the gross mishandling of vital wartime logistics." The heavily armed MPS leveled their Thompson submachine guns, racking the bolts loudly, aiming them directly at the exhausted, soot-covered men who had just saved the entire American convoy from an apex predator. The betrayal was absolute. It was a crushing, agonizing weight that hurt infinitely more than the deafening shockwave of the Baker's bomb. They had fought the ultimate enemy, commanded the laws of physics, and won an unwinnable war. And their reward was to be stared down by the guns of their own commanders, their impossible heroism entirely erased, stolen, and buried by the very establishment that had left them to die in the fog. This is the exact reason you will never find the name Dutch Miller or the thermobaric phantom in your naval history textbooks. The United States Navy entirely sanitized the official after-action reports. The destruction of the Imperial submarine was officially classified as a spontaneous, internal, mechanical failure. The cooks were quietly dispersed to different ships, their records sealed, their unimaginable heroism completely buried beneath mountains of redacted paperwork and systemic arrogance. But the truth is written in the physics of the flour mills. The truth lives in the blood and the sweat of the men who actually do the heavy lifting in the dark, while the people at the very top take all the glory and hide the evidence. Tell me in the comments, have you ever pulled off a miracle at your job, only to have a toxic manager entirely steal your credit, or worse, try to punish you for the way you did it? Flood the comment section with your stories right now, because keeping the truth alive is the only way we honor the ghosts of the drifting barge.